History has a way of smoothing over the things that do not fit, like a cartographer erasing a smudge on an otherwise perfect map. Some records are not lost to time, but are buried beneath layers of official silence and the encroaching moss of the Siberian wilderness. To look into the archives of 1958 is to find a world obsessed with progress, yet deeply afraid of what that progress might reveal in the quiet corners of the earth. The flight logs of pilot Valentin Sokolov began like any other, detailing the monotonous drone of a Lisunov Li-2 over the endless green sea of the Siberian taiga. The mission was a standard topographic survey, tasked with updating the outdated charts of a region that few humans had ever set foot in. From the cockpit, the landscape was a repetitive tapestry of larch and birch trees, occasionally broken by the silver thread of an unnamed tributary. It was during the 4th hour of the flight that the horizon began to shift, revealing a geometric precision that felt almost violent against the chaotic growth of the forest. Sokolov noted in his log that the clouds seemed to part intentionally, unveiling a massive cleared plateau that should not have existed. 12 monolithic structures stood in a perfect 3x4 grid, their concrete forms rising like gray teeth from the earth. The cooling towers were colossal, their wide bases tapering toward the sky in a silhouette usually reserved for the heart of a closed industrial city. Yet, there were no roads leading to the site, no power lines cutting through the timber, and no smoke drifting from the open maws of the vents. The pilot circled the perimeter twice, his eyes straining to find any sign of human movement or a construction camp, but the ground remained deathly still. The survey film captured the scene in stark, high-contrast black and white, freezing the impossible grid in a series of grainy frames. In the developed photos, the towers appear almost translucent, their shadows stretching long and thin across the clearing, despite the midday sun. Sokolov remarked to his navigator that the structures looked less like buildings and more like a mistake in the film, a ghost imprinted on the world. Upon his return to the base at Krasnoyarsk, Sokolov's report was met with a quiet, chilling sort of bureaucratic indifference, the kind that settled deeper than any interrogation ever could. The flight canisters were taken away before the propellers had even finished their slow turning, and the ground crew was told to strike the coordinates from the mission log. The pilot was told that a localized atmospheric phenomenon, a rare mirage known as Fata Morgana, had likely distorted his perception of the terrain. However, a mirage does not leave behind a physical impression on the magnetic field of the Earth. Months later, a small expedition was organized under the guise of geological research to visit the exact coordinates Sokolov had marked on his personal map. The team traveled by river and then by foot, hacking through a density of forest that suggested no human had passed through for a century. As they neared the site of the grid, the lead surveyor noticed that the needles of their compasses had begun to spin in slow, rhythmic circles. There was no iron ore in the region to account for such a disturbance, and the air felt heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that set their teeth on edge. The trees in this sector were stunted and twisted, their branches growing in unnatural, angular patterns that mimicked the geometry Sokolov had described. When they finally broke through the tree line, into the clearing, they found a void instead of a monument. The earth was flat and covered in a carpet of pale lichen, but there were no towers, no concrete, and no scorched earth to indicate they had ever been there. It was as if the forest had reclaimed 1,000 years of growth in the span of 6 months, erasing the industrial scars entirely. The expedition leader knelt to examine the soil, speaking softly, finding it strangely warm to the touch, despite the autumn chill of the Siberian air. Deep beneath the moss, he uncovered a fragment of a glass insulator, cracked and blackened by an intense heat that should have incinerated the surrounding foliage. He tucked the artifact into his pocket, sensing that the silence of the clearing was not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of something waiting. Back in the dim light of their tent that evening, the men pored over the original survey prints that the navigator had managed to hide from the authorities. The 12 towers sat mockingly in the photographs, solid and undeniable against the backdrop of the taiga. It was impossible to reconcile the image in their hands with the pristine, ancient wilderness they had stood upon just hours before. The navigator whispered that perhaps they weren't looking at a place that had been destroyed, but a place that had not yet arrived. He pointed to the way the light touched the cooling towers in the photo, noting how the shadows fell toward the north, while the sun in the image rested low in the western sky. The evidence suggested a fundamental fracture in the logic of the landscape, a quiet, unsettling anomaly, one that defied the basic laws of light and shadow. As the wind howled through the pines outside, the team felt a growing sense of displacement, as if the forest itself was shifting its borders around them. They decided to leave at first light, abandoning their samples and marking the area as a restricted zone for their own safety. The mystery of Sector 7 was no longer a matter of missing infrastructure, but a question of how the Earth could hold a memory of something that refused to exist. The second expedition's return to the regional capital was marked by a quiet, pervasive dread that none of the men could quite articulate in their official debriefings. The glass fragment, the only physical evidence of the grid's existence, disappeared from the evidence locker within 48 hours of their arrival. Each member of the team was reassigned to different far-flung corners of the Soviet Union, effectively scattering the witnesses to the silence of Sector 7. Years passed, and the event became a ghost story, whispered in the back rooms of the Ministry of Geology, a tale of a phantom city that appeared only to those who weren't looking for it. In 1972, an archivist named Ilona Petrova stumbled upon a series of unsent telegrams tucked into the binding of a discarded field manual. The messages were from the 1958 ground team, detailing a secondary discovery they had omitted from their final sanitized report. According to the telegrams, the ground team had not been alone in the clearing. They had found a series of deep vertical shafts located exactly where the center of the grid should have been. These shafts were perfectly circular, lined with a smooth fused material that resembled obsidian and hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. One telegram mentioned a technician lowering a weighted line into a shaft, only for the rope to be severed cleanly after descending 300 meters into the dark. The archivist's research led her to a restricted wing of the Central Archives, a quiet corridor where the original, confiscated film reels from pilot Sokolov's flight were rumored to rest. She found them tucked beneath a false classification for meteorological cloud studies, hidden in plain sight among thousands of ordinary weather reports. When she finally viewed the footage, she realized that the 12 towers weren't simply structures at all. They were moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting in a way the human eye was never meant to catch. In the film, the cooling towers seemed to vibrate, or pulse, their edges blurring, then sharpening, in a slow, steady cycle that matched the frame rate of the camera. As the plane circled above, the perspective shifted in ways that felt as though they slipped beyond traditional geometry, with the towers appearing to fold into one another or occupy the very same space, all at once. Petrova noted that the shadows on the ground didn't just point the wrong way, they flickered, softly, as if the light source was not the sun, but something resting deep beneath the earth. Determined to find the truth, Petrova tracked down the last surviving member of the 1958 expedition, a former surveyor living in a remote village near Lake Baikal. The old man lived in a house filled with clocks. All of them stopped at exactly the same time, 14, 22, the moment they had first entered the clearing. He refused to speak of the towers, but he showed her his hands, covered in intricate, geometric scars. Scars he claimed had appeared overnight, after they left the site. He described a sensation of thick time, a heaviness that seemed to settle over the air in Sector 7, a feeling that every movement was being mirrored by something unseen. He claimed that while they stood in the empty clearing, they could hear the sound of heavy machinery and the voices of men echoing from just a few feet away. Yet the forest around them remained vacant. It was as if two versions of the same coordinate were trying to occupy the coordinate at once, and the towers were the only thing bridging the gap. Petrova's investigation was suddenly halted when she was visited by two men in civilian clothes who claimed to represent a special committee for ecological preservation. They didn't threaten her, but they presented her with a series of recent satellite images of the Sector 7 coordinates, showing a perfectly circular lake where the clearing had been. They explained that a localized seismic event had caused the ground to collapse into an underground aquifer, erasing the site forever. The images were convincing, showing the deep, dark blue of a cold Siberian lake, surrounded by healthy, upright timber. Yet, when Petrova examined the photos with a magnifying glass, she saw a faint, pale grid shimmering just beneath the surface of the water. The 12 towers were still there, submerged in the depths, their tops barely visible through the murky liquid, like the tombstones of a civilization that had never been born. She realized then that the ecological preservation was actually a containment strategy, a way to drown the anomaly before it could fully stabilize in the physical world. The thermal venting mentioned in later reports was only a convenient cover for the massive amount of energy required to keep the site suppressed. But the lake was not a natural feature. It was a lid, a heavy weight of water, intended to hold down a secret that refused to stay buried. In her final journal entry, Petrova wrote about a strange transmission she had intercepted on a shortwave radio frequency while studying the Sector 7 files. She described a series of 12 tones, repeating at irregular intervals, followed by a voice reciting coordinates that shifted by only a few meters each day. And the voice, she said, sounded remarkably like Pilot Sokolov, even though he had been dead for more than a decade. The transmission suggested that the ghost grid was not a fixed location, but a moving target, a tear in the fabric of the taiga that drifted slowly across the continent. Petrova disappeared shortly after making this entry, leaving behind a desk scattered with maps of the Arctic Circle and a single cracked glass insulator. Her room was found perfectly tidy, except for a compass on her nightstand, turning in a slow, rhythmic circle, pointing north. As the 1970s came to a close, the files on Sector 7 were officially purged from the central records, and the Lake of the 12 was removed from all subsequent topographic charts. The region was declared a high-risk radiation zone due to unstable geological deposits, ensuring that no hikers or researchers would wander into the area. The silence of the Siberian wilderness returned, but it was a guarded, artificial silence that felt increasingly fragile. In the early 1990s, during the chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union, a group of independent cartographers obtained a set of declassified Swedish satellite images taken over the Siberian interior. The photographs showed the Lake of the 12, not as a body of water, but as a perfectly circular patch of dead white forest. There was no water to be found, only a bleached graveyard of timber that seemed to have been flash frozen in a moment of extreme atmospheric pressure. The most disturbing detail was a series of faint geometric lines connecting the dead trees, forming a pattern that mirrored the original 1958 survey grid. It appeared the anomaly had not been submerged, but had instead broadcast its own architecture onto the organic matter of the forest itself. The trees hadn't just died, they had been rearranged, their trunks pulled toward the centers of the invisible towers, like iron filings toward a magnet. In a forgotten storage locker in Omsk, a technician discovered a box of magnetic tapes labeled Sector 7 Acoustic Logs, 1988. The recordings captured the final automated pulses from the sensors left behind by the second expedition, decades earlier. And instead of the expected static of the wilderness, the tapes were filled with the sound of a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to originate from deep within the bedrock. Interspersed with the mechanical thrumming were bursts of human speech, distorted beneath a heavy layer of electromagnetic interference. Analysts who studied the tapes claimed the voices were not from 1958, nor were they contemporary to the 1980s recording. They spoke of a failed integration and a, quote, stabilization of the grid, using terminology that did not exist in the scientific lexicon of the era in which the tapes were supposedly made. By 2004, the coordinates of Sector 7 were revisited by a private drone team, seeking to debunk the legends once and for all. Their high-definition cameras recorded a landscape that was entirely indistinguishable from the rest of the taiga, a seamless expanse of green. Yet, when the drone hovered over the exact center of the grid, its internal clock began to accelerate, gaining 3 hours in the span of a single minute. The drone's sensor suite detected a massive hollow space beneath the forest floor, a series of 12 interconnected chambers, each one perfectly matching the dimensions of the cooling towers. These chambers were not made of concrete or steel, but of a substance that absorbed every radar pulse, returning nothing but a quiet void to the drone's display. And slowly, the team realized the towers had not vanished at all. They had simply retracted, sinking into the earth like a lung, exhaling. One of the final images transmitted by the drone before its signal cut out showed a single rusted survey stake from 1958 standing quietly in the middle of a modern-day thicket. Hanging from the stake was a tattered flight jacket, its leather remarkably preserved despite nearly 50 years of exposure to the elements. The nameplate on the jacket was still legible in the flickering light of the drone's camera, V. Sokolov. There were no remains nearby, no signs of a struggle, and no tracks leading away from the stake into the woods. The jacket appeared as if it had been placed there recently, a clean and deliberate marker left in a place where time refused to follow a linear path. When the recovery team arrived to retrieve the drone a week later, the stake, the jacket, and the drone itself were nowhere to be found. Today, those who fly over the region report a strange shimmering in the air, a heat haze that lingers even in the depths of the sub-zero Siberian winter. Pilots are instructed to keep a wide berth around the coordinates, officially because of magnetic interference with navigation systems. Yet, many avoid the area for another reason: a feeling of profound wrongness. A sense that the sky above Sector 7 is thinner than it is anywhere else. The declassified reports now suggest that the towers were part of a subterranean project meant to harness the Earth's crust for energy, spoken of in a tone quiet and low, as though the truth itself were still settling into place. They say the experiment accidentally thinned the boundary between the physical world and its own potential, a boundary that was never meant to bend, never meant to be touched. The towers were the vents for a heat that was not thermal, but temporal, a slow, steady exhalation from a process the human mind was never meant to comprehend. And now, the grid remains. A permanent scar on the Earth's memory, a ghost that waits for the right conditions to solidify once more. In the archives of the modern Russian Federation, the file for Sector 7 remains open, though it holds only a single, updated sheet of paper. It is a topographic map of the region, meticulously detailed, verified by the most advanced satellite technology available. And in the center of that map, there is a small, hand-drawn circle in red ink, accompanied by a single word, scrawled quietly in the margin: waiting. The true nature of the ghost grid lies in the silence between the records, in the spaces where the maps fail and the compasses spin. We are left with the grainy photographs of a pilot who saw too much, and the empty jacket of a man who never came home. The forest continues to grow, and the snow continues to fall, but the earth beneath Sector 7 remembers a geometry that the world has tried to forget. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing about a mystery is not that it remains unsolved, but that the evidence suggests it is still happening, just out of sight. The archive remains open, though the ink is fading, and some pages seem to have been written by hands that have not yet been born. Watch the maps, for they change when no one is looking.